and welcome to our discussion today on Kautilya in modern governance and diplomacy. We are particularly honored to have today with us Professor Subrata Mitra, the leading expert on Kautilya's philosophy and generally the way how traditional thinking, Indian in particular, but also worldwide, impacts the modern diplomacy and governance. Professor Subrata Mitra is Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the South Asia Institute at Heidelberg University in Germany. As you will be hearing from his expose and from our discussion, he was trying to make these bridges, thinking cognitive bridges between past, Indian past, and modernity. And in very rigorous way to see what we can borrow the past and how the past impacts today and possible future. Professor Mitra was very kind to accept one small experiment that we did with this webinar. We created AI assistant based on Arthashastra texts and also his writings and reflections. And you can chat, ask the questions. You can see also the answer to the questions that AI system already provided. And Professor Mitra told me one thing that he found it quite powerful and also reminding him on some things that he didn't think immediately about. But we agreed to put the following challenge. In the spirit of Diplo approach, to have and to prove that human intelligence and human creativity, in this case, one of the Subrata, is much more superior than what machines can offer us. Yes, machines are powerful, they can give interesting answers, they can write the thesis, but this cutting edge of moment of creativity, making historical parallels, it is still our prerogative, when I say our, us as the humans. This is the first in series of the sessions that we will do in order to dig out ancient thinking of relevance for today. We are sometimes what we call chrono-narcissistic. We think that everything is happening now and here, and forget that things in the history were also reflecting on the love, hate, death, organization of society, and many other issues. And India has very, very rich tradition, which unfortunately is sometimes forgotten. Before I pass floor to Subrata to provide his introductory remarks, I first would like to thank Ambassador Kishan Rana, Diplo Senior Fellow, great friend of Diplo, who suggested this to this webinar, and thank you, Kishan, for that. We will proceed in the following way. Subrata will give his introductory expose. Then we will consult what AI answered and what were the questions that were half answered by AI and ask Subrata to comment on that. And then we will open the floor for you here in the Zoom room. But also, as you know, we are broadcasting through LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. And my colleague, Sonia Herring, who is here with us, is monitoring all four channels. Therefore, she will bring the questions to us. Subrata, it's great to have you today here. Please let us know, frame this discussion in the way you find appropriate. The floor is yours.
Jovan, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you very much to the whole Diplo team for combining the best of thinking with the best of technology. But before I start, there is another person I have to thank and fold my hands to, that is Ambassador Kishan Rana. He not only discovered me in Heidelberg, where I've been lost, and brought me into such a wonderful company where ideas matter and conversations are important. Thank you very much. My introductory remarks would have 5 parts. I'll first talk about why I have chosen this title, and then I'll say little something about what connects me to Kautilya, or what connects Kautilya to me. I would then talk a little about what Kautilya contributes to two different but connected areas, which is governance and diplomacy. I would then show how ideas go from the past to the present and present to the future, what use an author makes of the past and what use others can make of him. In that spirit, I would show you a couple of things I've done which go a little beyond Kautilya in terms of governance and in terms of diplomacy. I will end by asking a general question. How does Kautilyan realism differ from the realism that we know from people like, let's say, Mearsheimer, whom I follow closely? And how does Kautilyan realism help us to join the battle against what I call liberal imperialism, or the goodwill of imperialist powers to impose their views as if they were also good for us? That hopefully will take my 20 minutes. So, to start with, I've talked about classical origins of modern politics in India. So you might want to know, is there modern politics in India? Of course there is. There are political parties and there are elections which are very modern, and elections come up sometimes with great surprising results. For a long time, our liberal friends have been talking about India as a country which is going towards fascism or Hindu fascism, and that will be the end of Indian democracy. Lo and behold, India comes up in the last parliamentary election with a result which surprised everyone. It brought Modi back in again, but with a reduced majority. Of course, our liberal friends have not taken that on board yet, that India is not really going down the path of fascism, but it's a resilient democracy. And a resilient democracy which simultaneously, while keeping order at home, also keeps talking about the necessity of global order through negotiation and not through weapons and armaments. And the same Prime Minister Narendra Modi is going from place to place. Who would imagine going to Moscow and to embrace Putin, and then going to Kiev and embrace the embattled President Zelensky? Now, these are things about India's modernity, but there's a little bit of paradox about it. Why does modern India do things like the Prime Minister throwing himself on the ground in front of Lord Rama and consecrate, help in the consecration of a temple built on the top of a destroyed mosque? How about the cow? Why is the cow at the forefront of the cultural politics of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is a major component of the government in India today? So these are some of the paradoxical aspects of Indian modernity and resilient democracy. That is where I'll take off and go to Kautilya's Arthashastra. For those who are not familiar with the text, I actually use the Penguin version of Kautilya's Arthashastra. It's a translation of the Sanskrit text. There are several such. This is Rangarajan, and the other that we are using is the Kangle translation for the book that I did with a student of mine who has unfortunately left us now. And it was published in India, and I was very, very impressed with the cover that the Indian publication has. You see Kautilya presented partly as an ascetic and partly as a corporate wheeler dealer. So that is the book written in the 3rd century BC, and it is one of the earliest books on the science of statecraft. Why do I call it science? Because it is an ideal type is a book which comprehensively covers all aspects of politics and scientific in the sense that it has a dependent variable and some independent variables. Kautilya says, if you want order, you have to do this, this, this. If you want prosperity, you have to do this, this, this. If you want peace, then you have to do this, this, this. So that it's a bit of a modeler. And the argument I'm making is that implicitly, Kautilya's ideas have found their way to the political system of India, political process of India, and the resilience of Indian democracy. Now, you might ask, how is that possible? Was Kautilya part of the Constituent Assembly of India which produced the Constitution? The answer would be no. This is where I come in terms of Kautilya's connectivity to me. Of course, if you grow up in India, at least in my generation, there were many shlokas or sayings attributed to Kautilya that you repeat. And like one sloka that my mother used to repeat is Vidvatancha Nrupatancha Swadese Pujyate Raja Vidwan Sarvatra Pujyate, which is, what is the difference between a learned man and a man with power or a king? A king is worshipped in his own country, and a learned man is worshipped everywhere. So said my mother, and sent me off to the United States for my PhD. But there was nothing of Kautilya in my entire training as a political scientist. In the United States, I studied mathematical models of political behavior, and rational choice was my main methodological training. When I came to Heidelberg from Berkeley, I got an opportunity, and this is very specific to German universities, at least in my generation. There isn't a syllabus as such. The professor is expected to do research and produce out of his research knowledge, which he will teach. It's called Forschung bezogene Lehre. And I was trying to set up a whole program on the political science of South Asia. So I asked myself, I'm a man of rational choice and game theory, and I want to do a program which will make my students free of me, which will give them a heuristic device to deconstruct politics as they see it, not simply dismiss it as traditional, but see endogenous modernity for themselves. How is this possible? Then I asked myself, anyone who's been trained in Western political science will have to have some foundational thinkers, something about Greek philosophy and the Greco-Roman origins, many, many centuries of Christian church, St. Thomas, St. Augustine, and then comes the breakthrough to modernity, Jean Baudin, Hobbes, and beyond that, postmodernity. Implicitly, they would have to have these things in their foundation so they can study the Constitution of Switzerland or today the European Union and so on. I asked myself, what can I give my students which will rescue them from modernization theory? Modernization theory, which had argued that the past is bunk, forget it, our present is your future, and our past should be your present. And this is how you Indians can civilize yourselves. I mean, that is the mission civilisatrice which helped legitimize colonial rule. And I wanted something which would make students free of that. So I thought about starting already in 1994, an advanced seminar, OBE seminar, from Kautilya to Nehru. How do you go from antiquity, what kind of thought there were, and how do you go through colonial rule all the way to Nehru, who cites Kautilya often. That was in the beginning, and very quickly we found the Kautilyan realism helped my students in their own work, and the method we developed was called culture and rationality. How do you combine one man, one vote, people voting to get more of what they want out of life, that's rationality, and yet what they're maximizing, the domain of their utility function is deep culture. The culture and rationality became, I also wrote a book, and that became the basis of like 50 PhDs that we produced, including one of Michael Liebig, a gifted German student of mine who unfortunately died, but together he took my idea of reuse and showed how modern India has understood the Indian past and strategically used that to produce a modernity which will be modern, accessible to modernity from outside India, but at the same time will be deeply Indian. That then is our connectivity. I say our because that meant me and my colloquium. And we set it up in Heidelberg. And then we linked up with the IDSA in Delhi, who were also looking for endogenous knowledge. And we did quite a few things together. It was a happy coincidence that Ambassador Rana discovered us. He knew Michael already and wrote a wonderful review of my book, Governance by Stealth. That is the connectivity. And I then had the joy to read his work on Churchill. And then we could develop not a polemic, but an engagement with what we have, what has been imposed on us, and how can we go beyond. So now only a couple of things about Kautilya. And Jovan, I have to tell you that what I'm going to give now is what I got from the super intelligent, what is it? Artificial intelligence. Now, the two core components of this talk are governance and diplomacy. What Kautilya is doing is to produce an ideal type of a state which will have successful governance. He doesn't call it governance by stealth. That's the name that I have given it, which is how do you produce maximum order with the minimum use of force. And diplomacy is how do you get what you want without necessarily using force. It's not pacifism. The danda, the stick would be there already symbolically and to be used only when you have no other way. So never mind the Sanskrit words. On governance, the character of the state is saptanga. Anga is body, sapta is seven, like 7 parts of the body. If you think of the state biologically, these are the 7 parts of the state. They are following 7 prakritis or 7 elements. Swami, which is the sovereign ruler, Amatya, which are ministers, Janapada, which is territory and population, Durga, which is the fortified capital of the state, Kosha, which is cash, which is treasury, and Danda and Bara, which is the army and the police, and Mitra. A state has to have its allies. So it's not only endogenous. The state also must look out a little beyond its own territory. And the ranking that I have given is the ranking Kautilya gives. So most important is the ruler, is the king. And like in the body, they are interconnected. So if you suffer in one area, everything else will suffer. Now, king is crucial, and this king is not there for his own pleasure. This is where we use Kautilya to debunk what is called Oriental despotism, that before the West civilized the non-West through colonization, it was all despotic rulers being there for their own pleasure and not for the subjects. The king has to have, and again, this is from the artificial intelligence. If you type in education of the king, this is what you would find. I would want to be a king in Kautilya's Arthashastra. According to Kautilya's Arthashastra, the education and training of the king was considered extremely important for ensuring good governance. and here are some key points. Comprehensive education covering various subjects like philosophy, scripture, ethics, diplomacy, and economics for the king to gain knowledge required for ruling. Now, the king had to be well versed in the Vedas and in Arthashastra, or science of rule, in logic, agriculture, cattle breeding, and trade, among other disciplines. And he also had to be trained in self-discipline, truthfulness, energy, courage, and a spirit of inquiry. Practical training in areas like military arts. He has to learn how to handle elephants and horses and chariots and weapons, administration and security matters. King was required to practice yoga and meditation to control his senses and develop mental fortitude. The Kautilya advocated that the heir apparent should start training from a very young age under the guidance of qualified teachers. This holistic, organic concept of the state has to be taught to the king, and I will not go any further. This king has to remember that the Raja is there for the Praja. Now, as a student, I was taught the social contract goes back to Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Way before, Kautilya talks about an Indian form of social contract, that you are there not for yourself only, but for them. And in order to do that, you have to have a complete knowledge of what makes good life. Now, this king is allowed because Kautilya, the cynic, knows that people will not always follow the rule. And the king is being told, you have to have civil servants. But civil servants are like fish in water. Can you tell when the fish is actually drinking the water that he is there to protect? So the king has to assume that people will not follow the rule if they can do it some other way. And you have to be careful that order is not destroyed and Matsyanaya, or law of the fishes, takes over. What is the law of the fishes? The big fish will eat the little fish. The king has to learn to be the biggest of fishes in his own domain and hold on to the righteous path. That is so far as internal politics is concerned. Let's switch. I'm going a little fast, but I'll come back when there are questions. We'll now go to diplomacy. What is diplomacy? There are so many ambassadors in the Diplo network. You all know about it, which is getting what you want without necessarily using force. So, how does the king conceptualize diplomacy? First of all, for a king, you are in the center, and in the periphery, you have got other kings. Some of them are your Aris or your enemies, and some are Mitras or friends, and some are neutral. And the artificial intelligence will give you very complex combinations of friends, friend is friend, friend's enemy is enemy, enemy's enemy is friend, and so on, so that you know exactly how to place each state which is around you. And you have to remember that life is dynamic, politics is dynamic. There are no permanent friends or permanent enemies. Everything depends on how you are situated in the complex at a given point. So how are you going to tackle these other kings? Here he talks about Shatgunya, which are 6 different strategies, which is peace, war, neutrality, marching, alliance, and double policy towards them, which is pretending to be friends, whereas you have covetous eyes on him, and the other way around. How do you tackle people? How do you tackle other rulers? There are 4 things to do, or 4 possible things. Sama, Dana, Danda, Veda, which is to be conciliatory, and if necessary, give a gift, which is an investment. You can call it a bit of a bribery, and understand their own political system, and if possible, do a little bit what the British did in India, divide and rule, understand the divisions within their families, and go to their cousin who is against the big cousin but doesn't have the guts. So you make friends behind the king with his enemies. And if everything fails, the big stick or danda. In Hindi, you would say danda or danda. And this creates a dynamic framework which produces an equilibrium. Now, to pull it all together, I am not going more into detail of the Arthashastra. He has got very, very specific, precise advice on what to do in which particular case. And what I will do now is to more or less, this is not mythical. There actually was a king, Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of Maurya dynasty, and this Brahmin man had been humiliated by the enemies of the Mauryas, the Nanda Vangsha, and he had actually helped. So, if there was a Kautilya, or was he known by other names, we don't know, but ancient Indian social history is producing evidence of the actual existence of this ideal type of thinking. What we have done in our book with Michael is to look at Kautilya comparatively and go to some French thinkers. We have in mind Maurice Halbwachs, actually he was killed in Buchenwald in 1945, who has written extensively on how collective memory passes from one generation to another generation. The French school of Les Lieux de Mémoire, or Realms of Memory, under Pierre Nora, have done practical fieldwork on how memory communicates itself over long spaces and distance. And very, very important, we have used two other thinkers, Braudel, with the idea of habitus, and with the whole idea of the longue durée, of how present history connects to the remote past. And Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, who has used a concept of a state as a palimpsest. Like, think of a canvas on which someone has painted something, and you paint a little on it, and other people paint a little on it, so that a canvas becomes a multi-layer canvas. And if you look carefully, you'll find traces of the past in the present. All these things help us argue that Kautilya's Arthashastra has transmitted itself through generations all the way into becoming a common sense. And this common sense goes into the making of modern politics in India. Now I'll move over quickly to beyond Kautilya. See, Kautilya was an original thinker, all right, but there are others before him and his contemporaries, so there's a lot of give and take. In that sense, Kautilya is a flow of knowledge. So what have we added? There are two things that I have added. First, talk of Kautilyan punishment. Again, AI will tell you what happens if someone is trying to corrupt the queen. The queen is closest to the king. If you want to destroy the king, you don't fight him directly, you go through the queen, you try to corrupt the queen by sleeping with her. What happens to the person who sleeps with the queen? AI doesn't go all the way, but the book does. If the person who is corrupting the queen is a spavaka, he should be put into boiling oil publicly and burned to death like that. But if he's a Brahmin, he'll be branded, a hot iron will be put on his forehead and sent into exile. Now, this is something that will tell you that Kautilyan system is actually based on a very clear hierarchy of human beings, a Varna system, and Louis Dumont, the other French thinker, will call it homo hierarchicus, that the higher level would rule the lower levels. That will not wash today. Today, even saying this in India will make it a criminal offense because democracy has empowered, enfranchised, and entitled everyone. So when I wrote my book, Governance by Stealth, I asked myself, how Kautilyan can governance be? And this is where I discovered how files are actually written. How, see, if you look at the parliament, you see a law. But where did the law start? And how does the Home Ministry, which I used, whose secret files I used for that book, actually come up with a law? This is where I found that it starts at the lower levels of the bureaucracy, goes all the way up to the Home Secretary, who is a civil servant and a permanent civil servant, who has to work with a politician, who is his boss, the Home Minister, and the boss of the boss, the Prime Minister. The three have to agree for an idea to find the shape of a law. What is the job of the Home Secretary here? The Home Secretary has to think about the feasibility of this law, if he's doing his work well, and he can tell his boss that don't do it, it's no good for you because it will not work. This is where the balance between politics and administration comes in. And that balance, I would argue, and we have evidence in the secret files of the Home Ministry, that the wishes of different classes, different castes, finally find their way to make order legitimate. Or today, when you think about lawmaking in India, you have to take into account what are the Dalits or the former untouchable thinking, what are the tribal thinking, and how will this law affect non-Hindus, particularly Muslims or Christians for that matter. Today, if you look at an Indian newspaper, you'll find enough debate going on the necessity of order and for that order to be legitimate. So that is a thought beyond Kautilya. How do you factor in democracy into the Kautilyan method of orderly rule? And this you do by building into the process of lawmaking mechanisms that will tell the majority what the minority or what the opponents of the government might think. I'm not saying Kautilya was not aware of it. Kautilya had a very fine system of espionage, spies who should bring the contrary evidence to the king, who should alert the king, but there is no concept of a loyal opposition, a legitimate opposition which accepts order but which has a different political view. That is where I would argue we have to go beyond Kautilya to understand how order can be made legitimate. Now, diplomacy. Which path to take? Sam, Dan, Ved, Danda, of the four upayas. The king has to consult his ministers, all right, but how about beyond the minister, the people? What I have done, you will not be able to see it in our book, is to think of, I'm going to hold it very close, but the book is available to download free of cost. I've thought about the Bijigeshu or the king as sitting in the middle of a toolbox where he has to ask himself what will be saleable at home and what will be acceptable abroad. And this I've taken the idea from Putnam. It's called the two-level game. Every king, every state making policies must ask, what will my people want Should I aggress? Should I capitulate? Should I assert on our legitimate interests? And which one of the three would be acceptable by those who have power over us, by the superpowers? And the king, therefore, or the state, the government, has to find the equilibrium between saleability or acceptability at home and acceptability abroad. This two-level game we call the toolbox. You will find the details and how Nehru did that to keep India non-aligned and get maximum help from the Soviets as well as from the Americans, and how, in spite of all these anti-Nehru noises, the current government of India is doing exactly that, buying cheap oil from Russia, but at the same time sending humanitarian help to Ukraine. So what I've done here is to bring people in a democratic society, people matter, bring people in to the making of foreign policy. And this is done by thinking of foreign policy making as a two-level game, a game that is played within the state and a game that you play with powers that be outside. Now I've taken a little more than my 20 minutes, but I'll come to a close now by talking about Kautilyan realism, how it helps us or helps me give battle to liberal imperialism. As I said before, on Ukraine, I follow very closely Mearsheimer, and he has been talking about what will happen with the uncritical NATO expansion. He has started talking about it 15 years ago, I think, and this is exactly what has happened. But I would make a distinction between the realism of Mearsheimer and Kautilyan realism. Think of it this way. Think like Bourdieu, think of Kautilyan realism ensconced within a habitus. A habitus is an area with its population who have a kind of cognitive community who understand one another in terms of basic values. So the Indic civilization, in that sense, is a civilization which has its own value system, and Kautilyan Arthashastra makes sense within it because Arthashastra is not only Arthashastra, it is the alter ego of Dharmashastra. You have to remember Dharma, and Dharma is in Sanskrit dharayati iti dharma, that which holds together. And in Kautilyan system, the chap who is being punished accepts his punishment as legitimate because he believes that the punishment is there to make dharma possible, make transcendence of ordinary life, so that ultimately we go towards liberation of the soul from the earthly bondage. That is dharma, artha, kama, moksha, the four areas of life. Now, the four important things of life are dharma, follow the righteous path, artha, which is worldly life, kama, which is procreation, pleasure, and if you do it all right, ultimately the soul will be liberated and go to the great soul. Now, this is a core idea of the Indic civilization. I still remember in 1975, when Indira Gandhi imposed emergency on India, people started saying, adharma, she has done adharma. Now, adharma is to be avoided. I'm saying this because the Kautilyan realism makes sense within a habitus. Now, if you're thinking about Ukraine, if you're thinking of Russia, think of them as civilizational states or long civilizations and start the argument from there. What is good for Ukraine? What is good for Russia? And why is negotiation necessary? How can they avoid what brought me to politics, which is the Hobbesian idea of avoiding shameful death. Politics as a science was invented to make shameful death, accidental death, murder unnecessary, so that there will be a Leviathan, a Bijigishu, or in Hobbes, a king, a Leviathan, who would make order possible, and you'll give up your right to self-help in order to accept. But in the Kautilian system, you accept the danda, you accept punishment, because ultimately it will help you to go up. And this is possible, this value system is possible only if you take into account the endogenous culture. I have seen no argument about the endogenous culture of Ukraine or Russia, or for that matter, Gaza and Israel. How can you argue for the two-state solution without taking into account the deep culture of those areas? This is where I would argue Kautilya is not AI make easy. Kautilya is to think deeply about deep cultures, about longue durée, about how collective memory connects the present to the remote past, and argue out from there as to what are the choices. Do we capitulate? Do we aggress? Or do we talk about legitimate interests? And that, forgive me to have taken too long, in my way of summing up what I have learned from Kautilya, and in my own modest way, what I have contributed to Kautilya, to take Kautilyan realism the next step in terms of governance and in terms of diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Subrata, for the excellent expose. There are so many ideas, but I'm particularly pleased that you mentioned my favorite historian, Fernand Braudel, and longue durée, and basically basis of our thinking in our current time in the history. Layers like palmy steps, which Nehru said. I will learn quite a lot today in the topic, which is close to my focus, I'm sure focus of our audience today, the question how these deep layers of society can get into the focus and shape our lives. We will come later on, we'll have a limited time, we'll come later on to also your advice how to deal with AI, which is basically trying to unpack the questions of our culture. Now, what I suggest is the following thing. I will squeeze my sort of presentation on AI, but I'll just quickly share with all of you. You will just confirm if you can see my screen. Yes or no?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Here is the website of the event, and here you can ask the question based on the Arthashastra and many other documents. You just ask the question. One of the questions is, what is the future of humanity? You can ask any question. And we got quite an interesting questions related to daily life. You will get the answer to the question, and then it is going through the different open source systems, through all writings. I won't read the question, but what is nice, you have also all previously asked questions over the last 4 weeks, and you can see you can just click who should be Kautilya's favorite today. He mentioned Kissinger, and the reason why he considered Kissinger. Very interesting insights into the modernity. Now, out of all of these questions, there was one question which I'll ask on behalf of AI, which was not completely answered. This was the question between just peace and just a peace. Just peace is ethically solid peace based on the rightness, on the ethics, and just a peace is a pragmatic, more Machiavellian, more Kissinger-style peace where you see the conflicts. That line AI didn't manage to answer. Therefore, we'll ask our professor to reflect on that more. Now, what I would like to invite Sue Sonia, our colleague, to see what are the comments from the audience, and then we can go into the answers and wrap up by Subrata. Susonia, over to you. We have also Ljubcho raising his hand, and we'll try to have maybe 3 maximum impromptu video, and the rest you may pose the question in the chat just for the efficiency of our time. Susonia, what are the questions or comments from the different channels? Zoom, and we have 3 more channels, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. Over to you.
Thank you, Johan. Yes, we have some questions from YouTube and Zoom. And okay, one of our participants has quite a few questions. So I'll just cut to the chase and go through them. So Puru Singh has asked, how does Professor see the US-India relations through Kautilya's vision, and what comparisons and lessons can be learned from it? Yogandra Kumar has asked, if the Kautilian theoretical framework is entirely based on realpolitik, and if this theoretical framework would apply in developing norms for global governance, or even norms for contact of international relations in our deglobalized world based on a certain value framework. And he also mentioned Prime Minister Modi's op-ed, where he provided his own framework, the key feature of which being life and consciousness of oneness of the inanimate and animate. In other words, restructuring of communities for a sustainable global order. I think he's asking the professor's views on this. And finally, if there are any other Indian thought streams on international relations theory-related discourse in our current times and contemporary times. And finally, Nicolas Fiumarelli from YouTube has asked, given the mixed internet governance model India follows with a strong push for neoliberal economic digitalization, coupled with strong online content control, surveillance, and the most frequent internet shutdowns in the world, how can international multi-stakeholder forums address the balance between fostering digital economic growth and protecting fundamental rights in countries that follow such mixed models? And we had one last comment, which found it very interesting that the Western Foundation for Political Thought also starts as parts of the body, in this case, 3 parts of the body, in Plato's Politeia.
Thank you, Susonia. We have Ljubcho with the first comment. I can see his hand. And yeah, we continue. Ljubcho, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thank you to Diplo for organizing this, and thank you to Ambassador Rana for obviously having a pivotal contribution, as he always does, in making this conversation possible. Thank you, Professor Mitra, for really at least making my own mind kind of explode in many different ways. Let me use Indian techniques that have allowed me to focus it in one small area, because it could go into many. That comment on the relation between the body and the theory, it was something that I put up, and it came up as you were describing how you said 7 parts. Obviously, in Politeia, Plato goes with 3 parts. The interesting thing is that the most traditional interpretation of Plato's Politeia is that it's a blueprint for a state. I'm not one of those, and I interpret it differently. I do think that he really meant what he said, which is, let me present an idea of an ideal state so that you could see how an ideal ordering of the body and an individual would be. But there are many correlations, and he does go into those 3. Using again perhaps Indian Vedic knowledge, it is where the first, which he describes as gold, in Agnya, the consciousness that is there, silver perhaps as Anahat, and then kind of the stomach, the appetite. It is, if we're talking about artificial intelligence, right away we see a dissonance, a difference. If we're talking about how a state should be organized and connecting it to the idea of a body, we have this now new entity, artificial intelligence, that does not have a body. So if we're talking about any governance or diplomatic structures, this is where the division is. So let me not go further than that, but I would love to hear how that connection between body and statecraft, that is obviously there in the tradition presented in Kautilian kind of realism, manifest perhaps in today's world, but also the other way around, and body to statecraft, especially as we have artificial intelligence on the march. Thanks.
Thank you, Ljubcho. We have now quite an interesting question. The last question inspired me also to pick up on your thinking, Subrata, on the critical issue. Maybe we can start with that and we move to the other question, which is happening now. It's a question of our physical incorporation, our body and the governance. And it's becoming very important in the artificial intelligence discussion. And there are digital twins concepts of virtuality and reality. And that would be interesting to hear your view and what is in Indian tradition on this question of our physical incorporation and the question of virtuality. Because sometimes there are views that Asian cultures will be easier to accept artificial intelligence and other virtual tools than European cultures which have a strong focus on the physical incorporation. That's a bit philosophical issue, but maybe off the cuff, some reflection from your side and maybe guidelines for Ljubcho, me and others. Where should we look for that inspiration to deal with it? And then we have other questions. I will read them and we will move on. Please go ahead.
Could I go ahead now, Johan?
Yes.
Okay.
With the first question, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for those wonderful questions. I don't know how we are doing for time, but I will discipline myself, though I find it hard facing such rich questions. But I'll start with the last one from you, Johan. I think the whole idea behind yoga is to have that body-mind balance. And body-mind balance really means you don't deny the body, but you ask yourself, what is the higher purpose for which this body is there? How do I live and keep rising at the same time? So that it's not just exercise or muscle building, it's also building the muscles in your head, in your conscience. And this is why the various kinds of yoga have to be seen as holistic. And that, I think, would nicely match the balance that Kautilya is talking about between doing the right thing and doing the correct thing. Correct according to the law, right according to dharma. And that balance has to be kept, and that balance has to be kept by every individual. It can't be done centrally. To quickly jump to artificial intelligence. Look, AI can answer your questions, but you are the master of the questions. You decide what is important, what is worth knowing. And from Kautilya, what we're getting is a heuristic device. What is feasible and what is right. So righteousness and feasibility. That is where I think dharma or virtuousness comes in. Without that, no order can sustain itself unless you successfully inculcate the core values in those who are affected by those values. Otherwise, remember the whole idea of power. No power can sustain itself without the consent of those who are subject to that power. And why do you accept what you don't like? Who likes punishment? But the Kautilyan system, therefore, I would like to argue that think of the present in the context of deep culture and deep past. Even in the age of globalization, you don't live everywhere at the same time. You live somewhere. You draw on some values which belong to a habitus. This I'm talking about India, and I'm not therefore talking about Ukraine or Gaza. But if you are going to talk about them, understand them in terms of the depth. Recently, I went to Moscow to give a paper on the self and the other. How can the self take the other as seriously as the self takes the self in order to produce a moral, level playing field. And for that, I found this is recent work. I've not yet integrated that to my understanding of Kautilya. The self and the other brings into play what I would call this how to break through the self and the other wall of separation. Like, I think, you think, I think, you think, and this can go on. How do we break through it? We break through it by understanding what is sacred for you and taking the sacredness as seriously as I take my sacredness. The cow is sacred to me as a Hindu, but a cow has to be sacrificed by a Muslim. So there are two different sacrednesses, and how can they be part of the same state? This is where Kautilya, if you want to apply Kautilya here, you have to find a balance between Arthashastra and Dharmashastra. And you have to understand what is the dharma of the other. The other is an untouchable, the other is a tribal, the other is a woman, the other is a transgender, or the other is a Muslim or a Christian. That is taking Kautilya, as far as Kautilya would go, to the great slaughter houses of the world today in Ukraine, Russia, or in Gaza and the occupied West Bank.
Thank you. Subrata, we just got a few requirements to extend in emails that I'm getting direct messages. Therefore, we will extend those of you who obviously have to stick for a 1 hour session. Please feel free to leave the room. But it's so interesting, and it's not often that we get requests to extend the session. Usually people want shorter sessions. Therefore, I will thank you for Mr. Singh and others for asking for this extension. Here is a quick comment, and we have a few more questions, but quick comment, Subrata, on your last sentence or last line. It's a thinking of the Ubuntu thinking, which we often mention in our discussion, which says, I am because you are. And it's so deep and profound, and we will have one session with Ubuntu African thinkers of traditional knowledge in this attempt to bring that in the current discussion. And often is quoted cogito ergo sum by Descartes, I think therefore I am. It's an interesting difference between these views. Yes. Now, Subrata, we are going to the next questions, and again, we are not cutting it sharp after 1 hour. We'll continue to answer all questions. There were quite a few new questions. There was a question of US-India relation. What Kautilya would advise about it or comment on it?
See, I would like to think of US-India relations not only as a bilateral relation, but as a multilateral relation. Now, I've talked about liberal imperialism. Should the United States decide, like Foucault would say, like a doctor or a professor or a parent, what you want is not what you need. That's a big American problem. They are not able to place themselves in the shoes of the other. Now, India, as a democracy, shares democratic values with the United States. But India does not share the armament industry, which is egging on global conflict. Billions of dollars given to Ukraine, but those dollars come back in a recycled way to the armament industry, which is making huge profits out of it. This is where I would argue Indo-American relations are thriving, but let's remember that democracy is not only playing India against China. Democracy is about understanding the legitimate habitus of China, of India, of Russia, of Ukraine, or the United States for that matter. It's not a one-horse race. It's a multi-horse race. And that is something that Americans have to understand, and I think India has been very good in terms of conveying to the United States why India has to take her national interest as seriously as America takes American national interest. And the world is not the playing field of America. The world is a playing field of the world. And this is where I would argue about Kautilyan realism and not simply to take this neo-imperial liberalism of the United States, which wants to legislate to other people as to how they should live and how what they should eat, whom should they play with. Anyway, that's my take on the Indo-American question.
Thank you, Subrata.
I've noted
Go ahead.
different questions, and you started, Johan, yourself with a question of this deep layer, or palimpsest, as Nehru would say. What is deep layer? What is longue durée? What does one do with it as a policymaker? I think that was the question. That was, for me, a very valuable question. Do you think I could respond to that question?
Sure. No, it wasn't the Subrata, it is a part of the question, but also my endorsement, because I'm big fan of Fernand Braudel and these things. But please go ahead. Okay.
In the spirit of conversation, I'll talk about very controversial things. 1992, 6th of December, should remain a memorable day for anyone who wants to study Indian politics. What happened on that day? On that day, a fanatic mob destroyed with primitive tools a disused mosque which was standing at the place that the destroyers were claiming to be the birthplace of Rama. That is where I document the first breakdown of India's secular democratic state. There were soldiers, and in my book, Governance by Stealth, I've got a whole chapter on this event, destruction of the Babri Mosque. Now, why am I talking about it? I'm talking about it because the whole Babri Mosque thing has not been understood in terms of the longue durée or the lieu de mémoire of politics. If you deconstruct it, you would find that the mosque, which was built 400 years ago, was built on the top of what many Hindus thought was a temple which marked the birthplace of Rama. Now, for Hindus, spots on the earth are sacred. They can't be moved. You can move a mosque. A mosque is not a sacred spot as such. I mean, there are sacred spots for Islam too, like the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia is a sacred spot. But Hindus claim that spot as the spot where Rama was born, and it was a sacred spot for them. When you invade a country to show your mastery, you destroy temples, you destroy sacred structures, you build your own sacred structure on it. That's how history has operated. Now, there was already a battle on that, 1920s, and independent India did nothing about it except to seal it off. That mosque was no longer used. A longue durée politics would have said, now here is a dispute. The dispute is between two different forms of sacredness, and there has to be a negotiation, a negotiated settlement. Because that was not done, ultimately that empowered the criminals who broke that disused mosque. That's how I would argue. Why am I arguing about this? Because that's not the end of the matter. The Supreme Court solved it brilliantly by saying we have to go back to collective beliefs. They have not quoted Maurice Halbwachs, but they could have, or Pierre Nora, because the collective belief had it that that spot belonged to Hindus. What the Supreme Court did was a Solomonic judgment. It gave that spot to Hindus and the temple could be built, but ordered the state to give 5 acres of land for a mosque to be built within the city of Ayodhya. The reason I'm talking about it is because that is not the only disputed spot. There are many others in India today. And what do you do when you see as a Hindu bits and pieces of your gods on the steps of a mosque or the wall of a sacred Islamic structure? It has to be remembered that for Hindus, gods are like people. You put them to sleep before you go to sleep yourself. If you're rich, you have a temple in your own home. If you're not, you put a god in this corner of your bedroom, so that the gods are living gods. And for Islam, they take their gods, their sacred structures as seriously. Now, where is the negotiation taking place as to what to do about those temples which are destroyed, on the top of which mosques were built? I'm not saying Indians are the only ones who are not doing it. This is not being done in Jerusalem either. So when a spot is disputed over, I would say open up the layers, look at the palimpsests, as Nehru would say, and read different layers of it and bring together the spokespersons of the different sides and get the holy religious orders to rein in their extremists, so that parties, political parties, who can go about moderate politics and bring democracy, both sacredness as well as political order. So that would be a political scientist's way of using the longue durée and open up the deep layers, so that large-scale brutality of the kind happened in Ayodhya or the kind happening in Jerusalem will not be necessary. I've written about it, and I would keep arguing that the sacred matters for ordinary people. Life is not just food, clothing, and shelter. People ask, what happens to me after I die? So there is the concept of the higher life, higher level. That is what Dharmashastra is about. And I'm saying we have to bring the sacred back into politics and do the argument of democracy, not only in terms of politics within the system, but politics of the system. And that is how religious violence and revolution can be avoided and evolutionary politics can go on. So I just want to extend the domain of politics to bring the sacred back in again. That was one question, and only then the second question, just peace would be possible. Just peace would be possible through deep negotiation about the conflicting concept of justice by both sides. It will not be possible if the politics of Ukraine is decided in Berlin and Washington. It has to be decided in Kiev and in Moscow. It's Kiev and Moscow who need to talk, and not Washington and Moscow. This will be my argument. And this will also be my argument between India and China, a question that has not been asked, but a question that needs to be asked. How can India and China get on as good neighbors, or India and Pakistan for that matter? How is just peace possible between India and Pakistan and the conflicting zone of Kashmir? Now, I would be Kautilyan enough to say it will be possible if India reopens the issue of the partition of the United India into India and Pakistan and ask all over again, how do we respect the identity of Kashmir and still make it a part of India and make it accessible to Pakistan? These are things I can talk about as a political scientist, but in politics, they're extremely difficult to talk, as the practitioners of this conversation will know, as Ambassador Rana would know. But that is why I am in political science. And that is why I have accepted your invitation to join you in this talk, hoping these ideas of transcendental politics will trickle down to the level of ordinary, everyday politics. I don't know, I've gone on a bit at a length, I'll stop here, Johan.
Thank you.
I look at you.
Thank you,
to give me
Subrata.
some
There was
guidance.
one question which was specific, but I have to provide the context before we ask Susonia, because there were more questions. There was a question from Nicholas, which was more related to internet governance and fact that in India there are a bit of conflicting approaches to way how internet should be governed. There is a business circle which is for full integration with the global the digital system, government which is more cautious about also digital sovereignty, but also the high level of cuts of the internet, especially you mentioned Kashmir and other regions. Basically, the internet is cut. Therefore, the question was more how to reconcile this, all of these issues. One democracy interested to be integrated in global internet, in the same time cutting part of the country from the internet. But I think you gave the, let's say, ingredients to cook the answer, but maybe you will reflect on this.
I would be blunt about it. I'll be blunt. The superior powers have to understand and accept the fact that we live in an unequal world. That countries which are powerful can abuse the concept of freedom of trade, like England did against China in the Opium War, talking about the right to trade as a fundamental right. And people have to take into account the feelings of weaker powers. If a country feels vulnerable through invasion of internet from outside, I'll have to give it the right to protect itself by bringing in some restrictions on the freedom of the internet to reach everyone. Now, how much unfreedom is necessary for real freedom? Where is the balance? I would put the onus on the superior power. The superior power has to understand the sensitivity of the weaker power and self-control. Impose some restrictions on their power to invade other people's internet space. Now, India is supposed to be a bit touchy. Western democracies have complained about it. And I would argue, yes, it is open to abuse by authoritarian societies, authoritarian states. I would still argue that it's the more powerful who has to take into account the sensitivity of the less powerful. I have a quotation from Buddha: learn to be compassionate to those who are weak and who have to be protected. Be compassionate to your enemies.
Thank you, Subrata. What I particularly like you do in the really Diplo style and philosophy, you address questions frontally, but in substantive and fair and balanced way. This is sort of Diplo's philosophy in teaching and everything, that we give impartial view, but also address the critical issues, because these days correct talk and sort of avoiding the controversy is difficult. They should be tackled carefully, properly, fairly. And thank you for bringing that element to our discussion. I'll pass the floor to Susonia for the last maybe two questions, and then well, I can go till tomorrow. It's so interesting, Subrata, but we'll have a chance. But we'll have to close it with this extra time. Susonia.
Thank you, Johan. We have, yes, three questions, and actually two of them are related to each other, but I'll just continue. Kautilya's, okay, sorry about Arthashastra emphasizes the importance of strategic alliances and pragmatic governance in context of building a multipolar and peaceful global order. How can we interpret his quote, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," to promote a balanced and peaceful coexistence in today's international relations? Was the question. And similar to that, like, how do we reorientate the contemporary state to the founding principles of governance as noble kings who will work to the benefit of their governed? And finally, we have a specific question. Can you please elaborate a little more on the distinction between Kautilian realism and Mearsheimer's offensive realism?
I'll start with the last question because this is for me a core problem. Mearsheimer, as I said, I respect him very much, and he had already talked about the importance of gestures. That if I open my arms and look towards you, I am thinking that I'm going to embrace you, and you are thinking that I'm going to strangle you. How does the self understand what the other thinks? Well, by taking the other person's interpretation seriously. This is what I got from Mearsheimer, and he has been talking about it for a long time, that if Russia says, don't get any closer, we are afraid of you, should I say, no, there's no need to be afraid of us, especially when the other knows that if a nuclear weapon is placed in Mexico or Canada or Cuba, Americans will not be very happy about it. So Kautilian realism goes the next step. Where does Putin come from? What is the deep structure of Russian thinking? How do we go back to Tolstoy, to Pushkin, to the evolution of hundreds of years of the habitus that's called Russia? Or for that matter, Ukraine, which was part of that. How does Ukrainian nationalism differ from Russian nationalism? This is where I would bring in the concept of the sacred or Dharmashastra. The Kautilian idea would be to make politics politics standing on two legs. One is the artha, the material leg, the other is the spiritual leg. And I would then ask about the spirituality or the conflict of the two spiritualities. And that is a heuristic device. And for that, you have to go way beyond in history and go to the longue durée. I'm not particularly well versed in Orthodox Christianity, but Orthodox Christianity is also present in Ukraine. Why can't the two variations of Orthodox Christianity talk to one another about where is the middle ground? Or for that matter, where is the middle ground between ancient Judaism and ancient Islam? How do we go back to those thousands of years of conflict and start from there to find a spiritual basis for a two-state solution, or a spiritual basis for good neighborliness between Ukraine and Russia? That is the little twist I'm giving to Mearsheimer's realism in terms of adding a bit of Kautilian Dharmashastra or spirituality to it. I'm not a starry-eyed pacifist at all. I simply believe that in every mind, there is a spot where you'll not be touched without your permission. Because if you are, you'll feel violated, then you would want to cut your wrists or cut her throat. So that is where all rage breaks out. Now, heuristically speaking, where is that spot where you feel violated? That is to be discovered. AI will not help you. A bit of history might, or a bit of Indology, in the Indian case, might. It calls for research. I'll quickly now go to the other two questions. Enemy's enemy is my friend for now. It's a dynamic world, and don't have any confusions about a long-term relationship in terms of thinking. That was the Indian mistake. Nehru thought we can propitiate China and give up all claims to Tibet. And this is how the Nehruvian doctrine of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai started. Until, and Nehru forgot, that the 4 upayas have to be taken seriously. Sham, Dan, Ved, Danda. And that, if you make yourself vulnerable, then your neighbor, Kautilyan way, would want to expand to you. So what India is now doing, I think is the right thing to do. Put 50,000 men and probably 3 times as many in the high Himalayas to show that if you bite us, we'll bite you. But at the same time, keep a channel of negotiation open. And this has created, for now, some tranquility. Also, on the line of no control with Pakistan. So the challenge here is to remember that that diplomacy is a 4-fold process, Sham, Dan, Danda, Ved. Governance. Governance is not simply keeping order. Governance is also keeping legitimacy. And legitimacy entails the self understanding the other, not only in terms of food, clothing, and shelter, but also in terms of the gods or goddesses or spirituality or sacred spaces of the other. If you don't expand the scope of politics, then you'll be denying politics the scope which anti-politics or violence will take over. That will be my Kautilyan way of enhancing governance by stealth. In the book, I'm talking about order, welfare, and identity, how all 3 have to be taken into account for legitimate order to be possible. And order which is not legitimate is not sustainable. And the government of Bangladesh discovered it when Sheikh Hasina fell like a house of cards. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Subrata, for this great answers, comments, and real treat for all of us, I would say. Even many colleagues stayed for this extra half an hour. Let me just bring a few good news. We'll have a recording from the session and transcript which we will add to our AI system. And there are many questions which we will try to tackle in the follow-up to this discussion. But you will receive the summary discussion, you will receive transcript, and I invite you to continue using the AI system, which we will enrich with the references that Subrata made today. One question which resonates as a strong impression with me today is that logically we were really enriched with so many interesting aspects that Subrata brought to us. But what matters is the one quote which I always quote Kishan, who is today with us, and thanks to whom this session was initiated. When he started teaching online with Diplo 20 plus years ago, he basically went to his guru, and his guru asked him what he was doing, and he said, "I'm teaching online." And the key question which Kishan was asked, and I'm now paraphrasing, is, can you convey emotions online? This is a teaching, not conveying information, not conveying given knowledge, but conveying emotions. And this I felt today, that in addition to really elaborate knowledge and deep knowledge with Subrata, you conveyed to us values of solid knowledge, expertise, but also modesty, and the compassionate call to rediscover our core humanity, which is not just based on material goods, but also our spirituality. And this is, at least for me as a moderator, the stronger impression from today. And with that, I would like to thank Subrata personally on behalf of Diplo, and I'm sure on behalf of all participants, based on their comments that we have been receiving. And we are looking forward to continue this discussion. There are so many threads on which we can develop and learn more from your not only vast knowledge, but also your deep humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, all the best.
Bye.
Mitra.